Okay, today the map is not the territory, separating religious belief from historical fact. I gave this subtitle name early in the week, and I would change that. I should have changed it. Separating religious belief from spiritual experience. That's what I really wanted to say. But historical fact is good too. But we're going to focus on the difference in religious belief, which is a good thing, as opposed to the spiritual experience. A few weeks ago, I told of how Myrtle Fillmore imagined Jesus in an empty chair, offering her guidance through her healing journey. It did not matter that this Jesus was imaginary. To her, he represented a focal point for healing energy that proved to be helpful for her. Any critical thinker would recognize this Jesus as a figment of her imagination. To simply pass it off as an irrelevant fantasy, however, would be to ignore the millions of people who found inspiration and guidance in Myrtle's visualizing technique and healing. So that represents a good illustration of what I mean by map and territory. That phrase was coined by Alfred Korzybski, I think it was his name. He was a philosopher, and I used that quote in my prayer book back when I wrote it back in 1990. But I think it's a very good way to think of this whole thing that we're involved in terms of our religious and spiritual teachings. But we know that the Jesus that Myrtle imagined was a tool for her, just a way to practice, a way to focus her thinking. And it's very possible that she was in communion with the Spirit of Jesus. I don't know, we can't say, but I can understand how she would use that imagery as a helpful way of thinking that, he's there helping guide her to her healing. And I think we all basically do that when we pray. If you're asking for some change and you're praying to God to help, you're probably imagining somehow that great being is going to work on your behalf. We're using our imagination. But I would think of the image of Jesus in this case as the map. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of directing the mind. To think that Jesus, and she imagined him instructing her, telling her how to change her own thinking, how to see herself, and all of that. I don't know what all went on. She did this for several years, so it probably evolved through the years. But the imagery was like the map, and the territory that she was after was the healing. So not just anybody could take that same map and get to the territory that she was after. She found her own map and she found her own territory. And so the important thing to remember is the map is not the territory. Anything that is any practice, any religion, any set of ideas that have been passed on from someone else, it's a map. It's a way to think, and what we want to do is take that way of thinking and get into the actual experience. If it is healing that we're asking for, then that's the territory we're after. And we can repeat the affirmations and denials of other people. We can memorize prayers. We can say them over and over. Jesus said, don't heap up many words in your prayers. Don't, stack them on thinking God's not going to hear. That's the map. And what we want to do is get to what the prayer is saying, get to what we're after in the experience of the prayer. And so I think this is probably what Myrtle was working toward the whole time, is she's looking for the stirring of spirit, something real to her, but using the imagery of Jesus, which was obviously very helpful to her. It may not be helpful to you. I have used that type of imagery before. I have imagined, in fact, when I write the stuff I'm working on now with Jesus, I imagine being with him, and how would you interpret what we say you said, back in the Gospels, what the Gospel writers put down. Who do you say you are? You ask me who I say you are, but who do you say? And so I have that conversation all the time, and I treat Jesus very much like a person that I know. And so I'm doing the same thing, I guess, that she is, but not with healing necessarily, but through writing. And how would you, Jesus, answer this question? We say that you said this line, the kingdom of God is within you. What did you mean by that exactly? And he says, I mean exactly what I said. The kingdom of God is not something that comes through observation. It's within you, and you have to go into your own inner room and shut the door. I can hear him say that. And I can also hear him say, now don't think I'm talking about rooms and doors. I'm talking about mind. I'm talking about how you think. I'm talking about where your mind is. The inner room, the outer room is that busy thing that's churning around all the time in your brain. That inner chatter, internal dialogue, as Don Juan called it. It's going on all the time, and we want that to calm down. So you're not going into a specific room, although you may, and there's a great benefit. A lot of people say, and I agree with this, to go to the same place when you become still. Have a place that you go where you make that your, that's what you do when you're there. You take time to let go and be still. But if that's the only place you can do it, then 99.9% of your life, you're going to be outside of that place. So are you able to also recognize that? I was listening to a guy talk about his near-death experience last night, in fact, and he was saying, you get so sensitive in a positive way where you're not just in a room, you actually are in that room. You are aware of all the stuff, and you're aware of that lamp, and you're aware of that the carpet and the chairs and the things. And it's not like making yourself be that, he said. It's just, this is the world I'm in, and it's beautiful. I don't say that too often about the rooms I'm in, because I'm in that busy state of mind where I'm not thinking about the room. The room has a function. But to appreciate the space you're in just because you're alive and you're in it, it's a different level. So, and that might sound to some like that would be just a waste of time to try to tune in that much every place I am. But the waste of time really is not doing it, because we're always someplace else. And that's, the mind is such a dramatic thing in terms of, you think you're here, but you're really thinking about something else. Just watch how your mind works. And that's an energy drain, and if you actually get to the point where you bring all of your attention, like in our time of meditation, when I start leading that, I start relaxing immediately. I start going into a different state just by letting go and saying those words and focusing on, this is a time we let go. This is a time that we don't try to figure out the world's problems and all my problems and all that stuff. We do something else. We let go. So we're talking about two levels of things. There's technique and there's experience. We want both of those, but we got to make sure that we're understanding them. Google Maps has opened a new understanding of this realization by providing us with a two-dimensional map and an accompanying three-dimensional street view. We can zoom in and instantly see the difference between the map and the territory. So we're all familiar with the map. The map is indispensable. I use maps all the time. I use GPS more now than an actual map, but sometimes when Beth and I are going through Kansas, I have a Kansas map just in case we get off on a back road someplace and don't know exactly where we are. But so we look at the map. So what is the territory? That's it. That's us. And that's a whole different world. We're here now. We're doing this right now in this building, and you would not know that by looking at the map. There's a huge difference. One's an animation, and the other is what's going on. And so that's how we would look at any religion, any Bible, any external map, any external thing that helps us to focus in. In my case, it was not a study of the teachings of Jesus that led to a mystical experience. It was a mystical experience that led to my recognition of Jesus as a mystic. I've heard people say, and I've said myself, I don't go to the Bible for inspiration. What happens, the way my mind works is I get inspiration, then I look at the Bible differently. I see it in a different way. I don't go there necessarily. Well, I do sometimes, I should say, just as a reminder of a verse I really like that's very inspirational. But my understanding of Jesus as a mystic came from my own experience. If I was just studying the Gospels at face value as I was taught to do, I would see him like everybody else does. I would see him as, well, he says he's my Savior, and if I believe in him, that I'll, be saved and all that stuff. That he died for my sins, and it's all in there. I can read that. But if I just approach Jesus from that point of view, I will pick up on that perspective of him. But if I go within myself and open my mind to a deeper level of experience, then I begin to see Jesus in a very different way. And that is, I got off the map, I laid the map down and went for the territory. And that gives a whole different view of who Jesus was. I never, in my early years of being in the Baptist church or the Christian church, having that exposure and that culture, I never would have come to the conclusion that he was a mystic. I wouldn't know how to think that way even. I wouldn't know how to recognize something a mystic would say. But as I have had my own experiences, I understand that there's a different language going on. And it's one that is coming out of that awareness of oneness with God, which is what the mystic is all about. So if you just use the map to try to figure Jesus out, you'll never get to the territory. That's what I'm saying. And that's where most people are. They're in that map mentality. It's the teaching that's been handed down through the ages. You're born into it. You never question it. I had a conversation with somebody about that. A religious question, a Jesus question, I guess, came up. And the person said, I was born a Catholic, and I never really thought about this stuff. I never really thought beyond, like what you're saying, I've never heard my whole life. I was talking about some of the critical scholarship, how the Bible was put together and stuff. It got into that level. And I could see in his face, he just went blank. That was not part of his thinking, because that's not the kind of thinking that's given out in that way of, on that map way of thinking. They will hand you the map and say, follow this, but it does not lead to the territory you're looking for. And sometimes people will go their whole life with the map, and they're happy with that, thinking they'll reach the territory when you keel over, when you're dead. You'll make it. You'll get into the territory. That's how the territory is defined. But the mystic says the territory is here now. It's a deeper dimension, and if you stay on the map, you'll never get to that level of experience. If that's how you're thinking, if you just, the Jews had 600 and some commandments that they still do, that they are to fulfill. Like be a good person, and there's 600 and some things to do and to not do. But that's the map, that, and it's a good thing because it does help people to be good people. It does help in a social setting for people to treat each other well. A lot of people say the main teaching of Jesus is love your neighbor. Well, if we all did that, that's a map. But I don't want to love them because it's a commandment. I want to love them because I can't help myself, because I drop all the barriers that keep me from doing that. It has nothing to do with them. It has to do with how I'm experiencing life. And if I'm wrapped up in myself so much that I see the neighbor as the enemy and, all that stuff that we do, that's all the map. The territory we want is, it doesn't matter what that neighbor is or who he is, who he decides or she. It has nothing to do with my attitude, because I'm able to drop down into the territory of love. And as I've said before, it's not necessarily that you like everybody. That's not the same thing as dropping down into that place in yourself where you're so strong that nothing they do can upset you. And that's the territory. That's what we want. It's a hard thing to describe, and it's a hard thing to actually experience, because we're so ingrained in this culture that is it's map oriented, and it's not territory oriented, because that'll come along when we die. But I was thinking that I've had about 5 maps in my life that I've followed, and I have found all of them helpful, but they have all led to something else. And the first one was the mainstream Christianity. I was born into that. I was immersed and baptized, feeling that I was doing the right thing, that I was saved, and just went along with that whole thing. And of course, the idea there is being saved is when you die, you'll go to heaven, and that's what salvation is about. But I also appreciate having that background, having that experience for when I talk to other people that are in that, and they don't maybe have a clue as to how I'm thinking about it, but I understand, the map thinking. I understand where they're coming from, because I got that. I was trained in that, and I thought that was truth. That was the real territory that we were after. But it was one map, and I'm grateful that I had that map for a time. Then I found metaphysical Christianity, unity. It enabled an alternative view of Jesus from Savior to Wayshore. So I was able to keep some of the traditional map, but change the way that I thought of Jesus. And that was very helpful to me at that time when I first heard that. In fact, it was extremely helpful. It was very exciting that Jesus wasn't someone necessarily who died for my sins. He was someone who lived to show me how to be free, and that I could do the same thing. I could follow that expression that he achieved. I could let the Christ in me come out, in other words. So that was good for a long time, and I totally appreciate that. It shook me out of that old fundamental way of thinking, and still allowed me to keep, much of the words, the wording, the descriptions, and so on. The Jesus, the Christ, salvation. What does that mean? It means something different now, but it's still what you want to be saved from is your limited thinking, of your limited perception of yourself, and see that you're much more than that. And then Christian mysticism was another map that I followed. It encouraged a direct experience with God. And I got that mainly from, first of all, from Emily Cady, and then Emma Curtis Hopkins was a real mystical influence, and Evelyn Underhill. Both those women, all three of those women, I should say, were instrumental. I think it was Emily Cady that really encouraged me to go within and shut that door, figure out what that was. And that was a big help. But it's still a map. You know, you're still trying to do something, and it did lead to an experiential breakthrough. But then you realize, because you can get into the mysticism of, say, the Kabbalah, the Jewish Kabbalah, or Madame Blavatsky, or some of these folks that they take mysticism to an extremely complicated level. And I don't think that's what Jesus did. I think he simplified things in a way that the average person could get it. And basically it's simple, that we live in this infinite presence and we have access to it. And so the question is, well, how do you do that? Well, you practice, you ask, you seek, and you knock, and you keep doing that until you make a breakthrough. It's not easy. It's a narrow gate. You know, everybody else is coming in through that wide gate. What I'm telling you is not easy, but it's the way to get to the territory. It's a map, but it's not the territory. It's a way to get to the territory. So mysticism is, which I adopt to this day as the framework, how to think. I'm in the presence of God and I'm able to experience that. It's that simple. So how do you do that? You must be still and let your mind rest and turn within, and pretty soon you'll make a breakthrough. The next map was critical scholarship. It distinguishes the Jesus of history from the iconic Jesus of mainstream religion. I think what critical scholarship allowed me to do is break away from that rigid map that I was given in the fundamental culture, Christian culture, that you see, it's very strong today. And the literalists will not appreciate critical scholarship. They will. The critical scholar will say, maybe everything we've learned through religion is false, or it's just religion. It's not history. It didn't actually happen. Like, did Moses really divide the Red Sea, or is there some kind of a story there that we can benefit from? And I was listening to a guy that swore that they found Noah's Ark. Frankly, I could care less if they find Noah's Ark. I don't think they will, because I don't think there was Noah's Ark, and I'm not even sure there was a Noah. That scholars question that. But there's flood stories in every single culture on this planet. And it's when you look at them, when you start comparing them, the world was all evil, the gods came and destroyed it, and there was like one good guy left, only one. The whole Babylonian myth, the Gilgamesh epic, it's called Utnapishtim, whatever his name was. Glad I didn't have that name. That was Noah. He was the one that built the ark, and he brought animals of all kinds, on this ark, and it's almost identical to the Noah story, but it's like 500 years older. And then when you actually look at the flood story, there's two different stories combined. One has Noah herds, two of every kind, and the other one is 7 of every kind. And some of the fundamentalists explain that, well, he had to have some animals to sacrifice, so he got 7 of the ones that he could sacrifice. I mean, they have an explanation. I heard a guy talking about the dinosaurs. Why didn't he do dinosaurs? And, the explanations are just, they can have that map. I'm never going to go down that road. It's like, but could you even get 2 of every kind of animal on the earth in the Middle East? They don't even live there. There's so many that don't live there. I know elephants were alive at that time, and of course when you in Sunday school, I remember seeing pictures of Noah's Ark, and there were elephant trunks, and giraffes and all these things. Well, that's crazy, to think that could actually happen. And how big would that boat have to be? They would surely find it by now, because it would have to be humongous, to work. And then who's going to clean the stalls? He had to have a big family. And then he gets off the ark and he goes off and plants a vineyard and gets drunk, and just like, well, I don't blame him for that at all. That would be such a mess. But, I mean, we start getting into this kind of thing. Is this really what we want the road we want to go down? Is this the map that we want to stay on? Where does it lead? And the critical scholar says, there's a lot of holes in this story, so historically we're looking maybe for the ark. There's nothing wrong with looking for it, but I don't buy that story at all, and especially compared to some of the other teachings. And a lot of scientists think that the melting of the ice, at the end of the last ice age, that caused the flood, because the water levels went up 600 feet or something like that. It was 400 feet. It was a lot. If the water was raised 400 feet today, that would destroy a lot of people, a lot of habitat. So something happened, there's no question, but what a scholar will say is there may be a bit of history in all of these stories, but then they're elaborated on. The map becomes the thing. It's no longer the territory. And then the last one is the near-death research. It reveals the soul is immortal and currently in a very advanced state. I was very into the near-death research to the point where I thought, you could probably make a religion out of this. The problem is the baptism is pretty rough. You gotta have a failed operation, or you gotta get hit by a garbage truck or something to have that experience. But so that wouldn't go over too well, probably, in terms of a world religion. But what we are interested in is hearing about it. But that was a map for me for quite a while, and it actually changed my whole thinking about the soul. The soul is now complete. Whether it's complete or not is debatable. We don't know, but it is certainly more advanced than where we are now in a body. The body shuts down so much of our capabilities. It's not even funny when you hear these people talk. They say that was real. This is not. That was more real than anything we experience in this body, and they don't want to come back. And they can't explain it. They can't explain what they mean by that, but they all say it. It's such a common thing. So that was a map to me. You look at all the things that they say. They have these life reviews. And again, that could be part of a religious thing where you sit down and you start reviewing all the things you've done that you wish you hadn't. That's so many of them are thrown out, in the life reviews. And yet they will look at them and say, I'm not judged by these things except by myself. So we could do that. You don't have to have a near-death experience to have a life review. You can take any part of your life that you are not happy with, that you wish you could live over, or you wish you hadn't done that or thought that way or whatever, and you can kind of get in touch with that. I have done that actually as a written exercise, and found it to be very helpful. I don't know that it's the same as having an actual life review. These people say that they'll see 1,000 TV screens, with whatever part of their life they want to focus on. They can look at it and it's all there. I can't even imagine how that works, or how we could relive our entire life in just a matter of seconds. Every thought that we've ever had, every emotion we've ever had. And on top of that, every thought and emotion we cause somebody else to have. If we've hurt somebody else, we feel their hurt. I don't know how that works. But they all come back saying, gosh, I wish I hadn't done that, but they feel that. So the point is, that's also a map. It's a way to think. It's not the territory. The territory is realizing the soul right now is complete. When you start thinking about yourself, that something in me is done, it's full, it's complete, it's a pure expression of God, that helps get you in touch with that level. And stop trying to be something you're not. Stop trying to fix yourself all the time. That's another thing they keep coming back and saying. You know, we try to fix ourselves, and we go over there, and we realize we're trying to fix the wrong thing. You know, it's just more like, let go of this. Let go of what we think we are, and realize that there's a wholeness there. And in that realization is how that wholeness comes out. It's how we start thinking of ourselves. And anytime we're self-critical, we're coming from the map mentality. We're not coming from the territory. Because the deeper you go into yourself, the more forgiving of yourself you are, the more you realize that there's nothing that has sinned, there's nothing wrong with you at the deepest level. And how often do we go there? You know, it's not real often, but we'll read a book about positive thinking. That's a map. You know, we'll look at the map, and it'll say, you know, try this and try to get to the territory this way. And all that's good, all of it's helpful. You know, we don't want to downplay that. But just to know the difference. Whatever we're studying now is the map. The territory we want to get is a change of experience, a change of how we see ourselves. So I've drawn important insights from each of these maps, knowing that beneath each one is the territory of experience that is most meaningful. In our continued quest for spiritual understanding, we'll each have our different maps, but we should always keep in mind the map is not the territory. So that's the way to think of other religions we don't necessarily agree with. It works for the person that's doing it. It's their map right now. And when I think of it that way, they're following a map, you know, and that's it means something to them. Do I agree with it? No, I wouldn't follow that map. I prefer a topo map, you know, a different one. But it doesn't mean that it's bad. It means it's working for them, and maybe they'll follow it their entire life. And maybe they'll get to that point where when they step off this planet, they'll say, gosh, you know, that was different. I didn't have to do all that stuff. That I'm okay the way I am. But that's every map that we follow, just keep in mind that's what it is. You know, no matter what our studies are, we're after something, we're after a territory, we're trying to get to a level of experience. Thank you for watching this week's program. If you enjoyed this video, please share it with others. We want to reach as many people as we can, and we appreciate your help. We have many subjects in our video lineup, so feel free to take a look. If there's a topic you don't see and would like me to address, just put it in the comment section. I'd love to know what's on your mind. Thanks again for your interest in independent unity, and have a wonderful week.